They say blood is thicker than water. Well, I'm 73 years old now, and I can tell you that's a damn lie. Sometimes the people who share your DNA can cut deeper than any stranger ever could. My name is Harold, and I'm about to tell you a story that will make you question everything you think you know about family loyalty, justice, and revenge. Because 3 years ago, my own daughter threw me out on the street like yesterday's garbage. She chose her precious husband's golden boy over the man who raised her, fed her, and put a roof over her head for 18 years. But here's the thing they never saw coming. I had something they desperately needed. Something worth more than all the love and sacrifice I'd given them combined. If this story makes your blood boil the way mine still does, hit that subscribe button. Because if you think family betrayal can't happen to you, you're living in a fantasy world. And trust me, by the end of this you'll understand why revenge sometimes isn't just the best dish served cold. Sometimes it's the only justice you'll ever get. Let me take you back to where it all started falling apart. October 15th, 2021. I remember the date because it was the day my daughter Sarah looked me in the eye and told me I was no longer welcome in the house I had been paying the mortgage on for 12 years. The house where I'd moved in to help her and her husband Kevin raise their kids after Kevin lost his job during the pandemic. The house where I'd spent my retirement savings keeping the lights on and food on the table. But I'm getting ahead of myself. You need to understand the whole picture to appreciate just how twisted this story gets. I raised Sarah as a single father from the time she was 8 years old. Her mother, my ex-wife Janet, decided she wasn't cut out for motherhood and walked out on us both without so much as a goodbye note. Just packed her bags while Sarah was at school and I was at work, and vanished like smoke. Left behind a little girl who cried herself to sleep for months, asking why mommy didn't love her anymore. I worked double shifts at the steel mill to keep us afloat. Came home covered in soot and sweat, but I never missed a parent-teacher conference, never missed a school play, never missed tucking her in at night. I taught her how to ride a bike, helped with homework at the kitchen table until midnight, scared away the boys who weren't good enough for her, which was all of them, in my opinion. When she graduated high school, I had enough saved to send her to community college. She wanted to be a teacher, and damn it, I was going to make sure she got that chance. I worked overtime for 2 years straight, living on ramen noodles and black coffee, just so she could chase her dreams. She met Kevin during her second year. He seemed decent enough at first, polite, had a job at a local insurance company, treated Sarah with respect. I gave him my blessing when he asked for her hand, even walked her down the aisle at their wedding in 2003. I was proud as hell, watching my little girl in that white dress, knowing I'd raised her right despite everything. The early years were good. They had their first child, my grandson Tommy, in 2004. I was there the day he was born, holding that tiny, wrinkled little miracle in my arms, feeling like I'd won the lottery. Then came Emma in 2007, sweet as pie with her mother's eyes and stubborn streak. I was the grandfather who showed up. I babysat when they needed date nights, fixed broken toys, taught Tommy how to throw a baseball and Emma how to bait a fishing hook. I was part of their family, part of their lives, part of their future. But then Kevin's brother Danny came back into the picture in 2019. Danny was Kevin's younger brother, the family golden boy who could do no wrong. While Kevin worked steady at the insurance company, Danny had chased big dreams in California, tech startups, investment schemes, always one deal away from striking it rich. The family talked about him like he was some kind of genius, this entrepreneurial mastermind who was going to revolutionize everything he touched. The reality was different. Danny was a smooth-talking narcissist who'd burned through 3 failed businesses and 2 divorces by the time he hit 35. But he had that charm, that silver tongue that made people believe his next venture was going to be the one that finally paid off. He showed up at Christmas 2019 with stories of his latest startup, some app development company that was supposedly worth millions on paper, had all the buzzwords down pat, talked about user engagement and market penetration like he was Steve Jobs reincarnated. Kevin hung on every word like gospel. That's when things started changing in the house. Kevin began questioning his own life choices. Here he was, 46 years old, working the same insurance job he'd had for 15 years, while his little brother was supposedly building an empire. The resentment started small, little comments about being stuck in a dead-end job, about wasting his potential, about how he should have taken more risks when he was younger. Sarah tried to be supportive, but I could see the strain. Kevin was coming home later, spending hours on the phone with Danny, talking about investment opportunities and business plans. Meanwhile, Sarah was juggling her teaching job and taking care of the kids practically on her own. Then the pandemic hit in March 2020, and Kevin got laid off. At first, it seemed temporary. The insurance company promised they'd bring everyone back once things stabilized. But months stretched on, and Kevin's severance pay ran out. Sarah's teacher salary wasn't enough to cover the mortgage, car payments, and everything else. They were looking at losing the house. That's when I stepped in. I'd been living alone in a small apartment since retiring in 2018, surviving comfortably on Social Security and the pension I'd earned from 37 years at the steel mill. I wasn't rich, but I wasn't struggling either. When I saw my daughter's family facing foreclosure, there wasn't even a question in my mind. I sold my apartment, packed up my life, and moved in with them. Used the proceeds from the sale to pay down their mortgage and cover the bills. I figured it was temporary, just until Kevin found another job, just until things got back to normal. But Kevin didn't seem interested in finding another job. Not when his brother Danny was filling his head with dreams of easy money and passive income streams. Danny's app company had supposedly been acquired by a larger tech firm for 8 figures. At least that's what he told everyone. He was suddenly driving a Tesla, wearing expensive watches, posting photos from exotic vacations on social media. And he had a proposition for his big brother. He wanted Kevin to invest in his next venture, a cryptocurrency trading platform that was going to revolutionize the market. All Kevin needed was seed money to get started, $50,000, and he'd be set for life. Of course, Kevin didn't have $50,000, but he knew someone who did. I'll never forget the day Kevin first brought up the investment opportunity. It was a sweltering July afternoon in 2020, and we were sitting on the back porch watching the kids play in their plastic pool. Kevin had been unusually friendly all week, asking about my retirement, my finances, how I was adjusting to living with the family. Then he hit me with it. Danny's amazing business opportunity. The chance to get in on the ground floor of something revolutionary. How a smart investment now could set up the whole family for generations. I listened politely, but everything about it set off alarm bells. I'd lived through enough boom and bust cycles to recognize a scam when I heard one. Cryptocurrency was volatile enough without trusting some smooth-talking kid who'd already failed at multiple businesses. I told Kevin I appreciated him thinking of me, but I wasn't interested. My money was tied up in safe, boring investments that wouldn't make me rich but wouldn't leave me broke either. The friendly demeanor disappeared immediately. Kevin got this cold look in his eyes like I'd personally insulted him. He started talking about how I was being too conservative, too afraid to take risks, how I'd never understand modern business because I was stuck in the past. I let it slide. Figured he was frustrated about being unemployed, about feeling like a failure compared to his hotshot brother. But it didn't stop there. Over the next few months, Kevin kept bringing up the investment. Sometimes directly, sometimes through Sarah, sometimes just casual comments about missed opportunities and people who were too scared to think big. The pressure was subtle, but constant. Meanwhile, I was watching my savings disappear into their household expenses. Mortgage payments, utility bills, groceries, car repairs. Everything was coming out of the money I'd saved for retirement. I didn't mind helping family, but it was becoming clear this wasn't a temporary arrangement. Kevin still wasn't actively job hunting. He'd spend most days on his laptop supposedly working on business plans and investment research, but really just watching YouTube videos about cryptocurrency trading and success mindset. Sarah was picking up extra tutoring work to bring in a little more money, but it wasn't nearly enough. The breaking point came in March 2021, almost exactly a year after the pandemic started. Danny came to visit for a week, and suddenly the house was full of big talk and grand plans. He'd apparently made another major score, sold his crypto platform to some Wall Street firm for an undisclosed amount. Was driving a brand new Porsche now, wearing clothes that probably cost more than most people make in a month. Every conversation was about money, about investments, about the opportunities that were passing us by while we sat around playing it safe. Danny had this way of making everyone feel small, like they were losers for working normal jobs and living normal lives. He took Kevin aside multiple times that week, having long, intense conversations that always ended with Kevin looking more agitated and dissatisfied. Sarah noticed it too. She asked me privately if I thought Danny was filling her husband's head with unrealistic expectations. I told her what I really thought, that Danny was a con artist who'd probably inherited money or gotten lucky with a few investments, and was now playing the part of a successful entrepreneur to feed his ego. I warned her to be careful, that desperate people make stupid decisions when they're chasing easy money, but she was caught in the middle. Kevin was her husband, the father of her children. She wanted to support his dreams even if they seemed far-fetched. The night before Danny left, he made his final pitch. We were all gathered in the living room after dinner. The kids were upstairs doing homework, and Danny was holding court, telling stories about his latest business deals and investment wins. Then he looked directly at me. He said he had one last opportunity before his current fund closed to new investors. A chance for family to get in on something special. Minimum investment was $50,000, but the potential returns were astronomical. He pulled out his phone and showed us screenshots of investment accounts, portfolio balances that showed millions in assets. Talked about compound interest and market positioning and all the technical jargon that's designed to confuse people who don't understand finance. Kevin was practically salivating. This was his chance to finally prove himself, to show he wasn't just a washed-up insurance salesman. He looked at me with this desperate, hungry expression and asked if I'd consider partnering with him on the investment. I said no. Again. But this time, Danny wouldn't let it go. He started questioning my decision, asking if I really understood what I was passing up. Did I realize how much money I was leaving on the table? Did I want to be responsible for keeping my family trapped in mediocrity forever? The conversation got heated. I told Danny I'd heard enough sales pitches in my life to recognize bullshit when I smelled it. That if his opportunities were so amazing, he shouldn't need to pressure an old man for his retirement money. Danny's mask slipped for just a moment. I saw the real person underneath all that charm. Cold, calculating, angry at being challenged. But he recovered quickly, laughed it off like I'd told a good joke. He left the next morning, but the damage was done. Kevin was furious with me. Accused me of sabotaging his future, of being too stubborn and old-fashioned to understand modern opportunities. Said I was holding the whole family back with my conservative thinking. Sarah tried to play peacemaker, but I could tell she was torn. Part of her agreed with Kevin that maybe I was being too cautious. After all, I was living in their house, eating their food, benefiting from their hospitality. Didn't I owe them something more than just paying bills? The atmosphere in the house became toxic. Kevin barely spoke to me except when absolutely necessary. Sarah was walking on eggshells, trying to keep the peace between us. The kids picked up on the tension and started acting out at school. I was living in a house I was paying for but was no longer welcome in. That's when Kevin started getting creative. If I wouldn't invest willingly, maybe I could be persuaded. He began documenting everything I did wrong around the house. Left dishes in the sink for 5 minutes. That showed I didn't respect their home. Watched TV too loud. I was being inconsiderate of the children's study time. Forgot to replace the toilet paper. I was taking advantage of their kindness. He started keeping a literal list of my infractions, presenting them to Sarah as evidence that I was becoming a burden on the family. An ungrateful guest who was overstaying his welcome. Sarah, God help her, started believing it. I could see her changing, looking at me differently. Where she used to see her father who'd sacrificed everything for her, she now saw an obstacle to her husband's success. A stubborn old man who was keeping them from their dreams. The psychological campaign worked. By summer 2021, Sarah was starting to bring up the idea that maybe it was time for me to find my own place again. Nothing personal, she said, just that it might be healthier for everyone if I had some independence. I reminded her that I'd sold my apartment to help them, that finding a new place would eat up most of my remaining savings, that at 70 years old, starting over wasn't as simple as it sounded. But Kevin had an answer for that too. If I invested the $50,000 with Danny, the returns would more than cover a nice apartment and still leave me better off than before. It was the perfect solution. I'd get my independence, they'd get their investment opportunity, and everyone would be happy. The pressure was relentless. Every conversation somehow circled back to the investment. Every family dinner included subtle hints about missed opportunities and the cost of playing it safe. They painted me as the villain in my own story, the selfish grandfather who cared more about hoarding money than helping his family succeed. But I held firm. I'd worked too hard and too long to throw my life savings away on some get-rich-quick scheme. No matter how much family pressure they applied, that's when they decided to force my hand. It started with small acts of hostility. My morning coffee would be gone when I woke up, with Kevin claiming he thought I was done with it. My favorite chair would be moved or occupied whenever I wanted to sit down. Family conversations would stop abruptly when I entered the room, then resume in whispers when I left. They were trying to make me so uncomfortable that I'd either give in to their demands or leave voluntarily. The kids were recruited into the campaign too, probably without fully understanding what was happening. Tommy, who'd always been close to me, started spending more time in his room when I was around. Emma stopped asking me to help with her homework. Family movie nights happened after I went to bed. Family dinners were scheduled when I was out running errands. I was being systematically excluded from the family I'd helped support. But the final betrayal came in October 2021. I'd been out grocery shopping, using my own money to buy food for a family that was actively trying to drive me away. When I came home, Sarah was waiting for me in the living room with a serious expression on her face. She told me we needed to talk. Kevin was there too, sitting in my chair with his arms crossed and a satisfied smirk on his face. The kids were conspicuously absent, probably sent upstairs or to friends' houses. Sarah had obviously been coached on what to say. She talked about how difficult the living situation had become, how the stress was affecting her marriage and her children, how she'd been thinking about what was best for everyone involved. Then she hit me with it. They'd found me a nice senior living community about an hour away. 1-bedroom apartment, all utilities included, activities and meals provided. It would be perfect for someone my age, she said. Much better than living in a house full of young people with different schedules and priorities. I asked who was going to pay for this senior living community. The answer was obvious. I was. My remaining savings would cover the entrance fee and about 2 years of monthly payments. After that, I'd be dependent on Social Security and whatever small pension I could scrape together. When I pointed out that this would leave me essentially broke, Kevin spoke up for the first time. He said that's what happens when people are too stubborn to take advantage of opportunities. That if I'd invested with Danny months ago, I'd have more than enough money to live comfortably anywhere I wanted. Even then, they weren't done. Sarah said they'd be willing to reconsider the living arrangements if I wanted to think seriously about Danny's investment opportunity. That maybe we could find a way to make things work if I showed I was committed to the family's future success. It was extortion, pure and simple. Give us $50,000 or get thrown out of the house you've been supporting for over a year. I looked at my daughter, the little girl I'd raised, the woman I'd walked down the aisle, the mother I'd helped support through the hardest year of her life, and I didn't recognize her anymore. The person sitting across from me was a stranger wearing my daughter's face. I asked if that's really what she wanted, if she was really choosing her husband's get-rich-quick schemes over her own father. She couldn't look me in the eye when she answered, just mumbled something about doing what was best for her family. I asked if I wasn't family anymore. The silence that followed told me everything I needed to know. That night, I started packing. But here's the thing they never bothered to find out before they threw me away like garbage. I had something they desperately needed, something that made their whole plan to get rid of me incredibly, catastrophically stupid. You see, when I moved in with them in 2020, I didn't just use the money from selling my apartment to pay down their mortgage. I put my name on the deed as a co-owner. Legally, I owned half their house. Sarah and Kevin were so focused on getting access to my liquid savings that they never paid attention to the legal paperwork. They never asked questions about how the mortgage payments were being handled or whose name was on what documents. I'd kept quiet about the ownership arrangement because I figured it was temporary. Once Kevin got back on his feet and they could handle their own expenses, we'd sort out the legal details and transfer everything back to their names. It was just a formality, a way to protect my investment in their property. But now that they were kicking me out, that formality became very, very important. I didn't tell them about the ownership issue when I packed my bags. I figured they'd find out soon enough when they tried to refinance or sell or make any major decisions about the property. Let it be a surprise. I found a small apartment across town, nothing fancy but clean and quiet. Paid the deposit and first month's rent out of my remaining savings and started the process of rebuilding my life at 70 years old. It was humiliating. Starting over like a college kid, but with arthritis and a bad back and no family to call when things got tough. I'd spent my entire adult life working and sacrificing for other people, and this was my reward, abandoned in my golden years by the daughter I'd raised alone. The first few months were the hardest, not just financially, though money was tight on a fixed income, but emotionally the betrayal cut deep. I'd lie awake at night replaying conversations, wondering where I'd gone wrong. How the sweet little girl who used to fall asleep in my lap had turned into someone who could look me in the eye and choose money over family. I didn't hear from Sarah or the kids for almost 3 months after I moved out. No phone calls, no visits, no acknowledgement that I even existed. It was like 30+ years of being a father and grandfather had been erased overnight. But I heard through mutual friends about what was happening in their house. Kevin had finally gotten in touch with Danny about the investment opportunity, ready to hand over the $50,000 he thought he'd extracted from me. But there was a problem. I wasn't returning their calls, and they needed my money to make the investment. Danny was apparently getting impatient. The investment window was closing, he said. Other family members were stepping up with larger amounts. If Kevin couldn't come up with his share soon, the opportunity would pass to someone else. The pressure was enormous. Kevin had already spent months bragging to friends and extended family about the big investment he was making, the financial breakthrough that was going to change everything. Now he looked like a fool who couldn't even secure funding from his own father-in-law. That's when they decided to try a different approach. Sarah called me in January 2022, 3 months after I'd moved out. Her voice was different, softer, more like the daughter I remembered. She said she missed me, that the kids were asking about Grandpa, that maybe they'd been too hasty about the living arrangements. She wondered if I'd like to come over for dinner sometime. Nothing dramatic, just a chance to reconnect with the family. I agreed. Despite everything, I missed my grandchildren. I missed being part of their lives, watching them grow, helping with homework and baseball practice. If there was a chance to repair the relationship, I had to try. The dinner was awkward but civil. Tommy and Emma were excited to see me, full of stories about school and friends, and all the things that had happened in the 3 months we'd been apart. Sarah made my favorite pot roast, and for a few hours it almost felt like old times, but I could sense an agenda underneath the pleasantries. Kevin was unusually friendly, asking about my new apartment, how I was adjusting to retirement life, whether I was making any plans for my money. Near the end of the evening, Sarah brought up the elephant in the room. She said they'd been thinking about my concerns regarding Danny's investment opportunity, that maybe there was a way to structure it that would make me more comfortable. Kevin jumped in with a new proposal. Instead of investing the full $50,000, what if we started smaller? $25,000 as a test run, just to see how the returns looked. If it worked out as promised, we could invest more later. If not, I'd still have half my savings intact. They'd clearly rehearsed this pitch. Sarah talked about how important it was for the family to take some calculated risks, to not let fear hold us back from opportunities. Kevin presented charts and projections showing conservative estimates of returns, making it sound like a sure thing. I listened politely, but I wasn't fooled. This was the same scam with different packaging. They were still trying to get their hands on my money to fund Kevin's delusions of easy wealth. I told them I'd think about it. But as I was leaving, something interesting happened. Kevin made a casual comment about how they were thinking of refinancing the house to take advantage of lower interest rates. Sarah mentioned they might look into getting a home equity line of credit to fund some improvements. They were talking about financial moves that would require my signature as a co-owner, and they clearly had no idea I was a co-owner. I went home that night with a different perspective on the situation. They weren't just greedy and ungrateful. They were operating under completely false assumptions about their own financial position. Over the next few weeks, I did some research, talked to a lawyer friend about property ownership and legal obligations, looked into what rights I had as a co-owner, what I could and couldn't do, what would happen if there was a dispute. The answers were fascinating. As a 50% owner of the property, I had significant legal rights. I couldn't be evicted without cause. I had say over major financial decisions. If they wanted to sell or refinance, I had to agree. If I wanted to force a sale of the property, I could petition the court to make it happen. Most importantly, if they defaulted on the mortgage, which was becoming increasingly likely as Kevin continued to avoid looking for real work, I could potentially take control of the entire property. I started paying closer attention to their financial situation. Sarah was still working, but teacher salaries don't go far when you're supporting a family of 4 plus a mortgage. Kevin was still unemployed, still spending his days researching get-rich-quick schemes instead of actual job opportunities. Without my contributions, they were falling behind on bills. Not dramatically yet, but the signs were there. Credit card balances growing, utility payments arriving later each month, stress showing on Sarah's face when she thought nobody was looking. They needed my money more than they'd ever admitted, and they were too proud to ask for help directly. That's when I decided to let them dig their own grave. The next time Sarah called, which happened with increasing frequency as their financial pressure mounted, I was sympathetic but evasive. I said I was still thinking about the investment opportunity, but I had some concerns about my overall financial planning. Maybe I should talk to a financial advisor before making any major decisions. The delay drove Kevin crazy. He started calling me directly, sometimes multiple times a day, pushing for a decision. The investment window was closing, he said. Danny needed an answer soon, or the opportunity would disappear forever. I played the part of the confused old man who couldn't make up his mind, asked lots of questions, requested documentation, suggested we meet with Danny in person to discuss the details. Anything to buy time while their financial situation deteriorated. By spring 2022, they were in serious trouble. Sarah had taken on even more tutoring work, sometimes staying at school until 8 p.m. to make ends meet. Kevin had burned through his unemployment benefits and still refused to take any job he considered beneath his potential. They'd maxed out 2 credit cards and were making minimum payments on everything. That's when they tried to refinance the house. I got a phone call from a very confused mortgage officer in April 2022. He was calling to verify my income and employment status for a refinancing application that had been submitted for the property. I told him I hadn't submitted any refinancing application. There was a long pause. Then he explained that the application listed me as a co-owner of the property, but the other applicants, Sarah and Kevin, had been handling all the communications. He needed to speak with me directly to complete the process. I asked him to send me copies of all the paperwork. What I received was enlightening. Sarah and Kevin had applied for a cash-out refinance that would have given them access to about $75,000 in home equity. The application claimed they needed the money for home improvements and debt consolidation, but they couldn't complete the transaction without my signature. And they couldn't get my signature because they'd never told me about it. When I didn't respond to the mortgage company's request for information, the refinancing application was rejected. That's when Sarah called me, panicked. She said there had been some kind of mistake with the paperwork on the house, that when they tried to refinance, the mortgage company claimed I was listed as an owner of the property. She was sure it was just a clerical error that we could clear up quickly. I let her explain the whole situation, how they desperately needed the refinancing to consolidate their debt and avoid bankruptcy, how this paperwork mix-up was going to ruin their financial future unless we could sort it out immediately. Then I told her the truth. There was no paperwork mix-up. I was indeed a co-owner of the house. Had been since 2020, when I'd used my money to pay down their mortgage and protect my investment. The silence on the other end of the phone lasted for almost a full minute. When Sarah finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. She asked why I'd never told them. I said I'd assumed they knew or would figure it out eventually, that it hadn't seemed important when we were all living together as a family. But now that they'd made it clear I wasn't part of their family anymore, the legal technicalities had become relevant. She asked what I wanted. I told her I was still thinking about it. The next few weeks were intensely satisfying. Sarah and Kevin had to face the reality that their financial future was completely dependent on the man they'd thrown away like garbage. The same stubborn old fool who was too conservative to understand modern opportunities was the only thing standing between them and financial ruin. Kevin tried calling me with various offers and deals. Maybe we could work out a payment plan where they'd gradually buy out my share of the house. Or perhaps I'd consider a partial refinancing that would give them access to some equity while preserving my ownership stake. Every conversation was a barely disguised attempt to manipulate me into giving them what they wanted. Kevin would alternate between fake friendliness and barely controlled anger, sometimes within the same phone call. But I wasn't interested in making deals with people who'd already proven they couldn't be trusted. Meanwhile, their financial situation continued to deteriorate. Sarah had to take out a payday loan to cover the mortgage payment in May. They'd fallen behind on the car payments and were getting threatening letters from credit card companies. Danny, their supposed savior, had mysteriously become hard to reach. His amazing investment opportunity had apparently closed to new investors, and he was busy with other projects that didn't include helping his brother avoid bankruptcy. Funny how that worked out. By June 2022, they were desperate enough to try a different approach. Sarah showed up at my apartment on a Saturday morning, alone. No Kevin, no rehearsed pitch, just a daughter coming to see her father. She looked terrible, exhausted, stressed, thinner than I'd ever seen her. The weight of carrying her family's financial burden was taking its toll. We sat at my little kitchen table, and for the first time in over a year, we had an honest conversation. She apologized, really apologized, not the fake corporate apology she'd given me when they kicked me out. She said she knew they'd treated me badly, that she'd let Kevin's ambitions cloud her judgment about what was important. She admitted that the investment opportunity had been a mistake, that Danny had stopped returning Kevin's calls, that the amazing returns he'd promised other family members had never materialized, that they'd been chasing a fantasy while destroying real relationships. She asked if there was any way we could start over, not the business arrangement Kevin wanted, but a real reconciliation between father and daughter. I wanted to believe her. God, how I wanted to believe her. But I'd learned not to trust pretty words from people who'd already betrayed me once. I told her I appreciated the apology, but words were easy. If she really wanted to make things right, she needed to show me through actions, not promises. She asked what I wanted her to do. I told her to get Kevin a job. A real job, not some fantasy entrepreneurship scheme. To start paying their bills like responsible adults instead of chasing get-rich-quick dreams. To prove they could handle their own lives before asking me to trust them with mine. She said she'd try. But trying wasn't enough anymore. Over the summer of 2022, Kevin finally did get a job, part-time at a sporting goods store, making about a third of what he'd earned at the insurance company. It was a start, but nowhere near enough to cover their expenses. Sarah was working herself to exhaustion, teaching summer school and tutoring on weekends just to keep the bills current. The stress was destroying her health and her relationship with the kids. They were living paycheck to paycheck, constantly one emergency away from complete financial collapse. And every month they had to come to me for permission to make the mortgage payment. See, that's another thing they hadn't understood about the co-ownership arrangement. While both names were on the deed, the mortgage was structured in a way that required both owners' authorization for certain transactions. Since they couldn't afford the payments without help, and I wasn't volunteering to help anymore, they were stuck. They had to ask me politely and humbly to authorize each month's payment from my account, had to explain their financial situation, justify their expenses, essentially beg for permission to stay in their own home. The power dynamic had completely reversed. For months I authorized the payments, not out of generosity, but because foreclosure would hurt my investment too. I wasn't ready to force them out yet. I wanted them to understand exactly how precarious their situation was, how completely they depended on my goodwill. But by fall 2022, I was getting tired of the monthly ritual, and I had a better idea. I called Sarah in October and told her I'd been thinking about our arrangement, that maybe it was time to simplify things by having one person take full ownership of the property. She got excited, thinking I was going to sign over my share to them. Instead, I offered to buy out their half of the house. I had an appraisal done. The property had appreciated significantly since 2020, partly due to the improvements I'd funded, and partly due to the general market boom. Their half was worth about $120,000. I offered them $80,000 cash for their share. It was below market value, but it was also their only realistic option. They couldn't qualify for a mortgage to buy out my share, couldn't afford to keep making payments much longer, and couldn't sell to anyone else without my agreement. Sarah asked for time to think about it. I gave them 2 weeks to decide. The debate in their household must have been intense. Kevin apparently wanted to hold out for a better offer, still convinced that some miracle solution would save them. Sarah was more realistic about their options, but selling the house would mean starting over with nothing. No savings, no equity, no financial safety net. But they didn't really have a choice, and we all knew it. 2 days before my deadline, Sarah called and accepted the offer. The closing was scheduled for December 2022, exactly 1 year after they'd kicked me out of the house I was paying for. There's a certain poetic justice to the whole thing, don't you think? But wait, it gets better. During the closing process, more details about their financial situation came to light. They'd been using credit cards to cover basic expenses for months, racking up debt they had no realistic way to repay. The $80,000 from selling their share of the house would barely cover what they owed to creditors. After paying off their debts and covering the closing costs, they'd have maybe $15,000 left to start their new life. Not enough for a down payment on another house, barely enough for first month and security deposit on a rental property. They were essentially starting from zero, while I owned a house worth nearly $300,000 outright. The closing was awkward but civil. Sarah signed the papers with tears in her eyes, understanding that she was giving up the home where her children had grown up, where she'd planned to build a life with Kevin. Kevin was bitter and angry, muttering about legal loopholes and unfair advantages. He still didn't understand that this was entirely his own doing. The kids were confused and upset about having to move, not fully understanding why their family was falling apart. Tommy, now 18 and a senior in high school, was angry at everyone. Emma, 15 and in her sophomore year, just cried. I felt bad for them. They were innocent victims of their parents' greed and stupidity. But I wasn't their grandfather anymore. Remember? Their parents had made that clear when they chose money over family. After the closing, I moved back into the house. The same house I'd been kicked out of 14 months earlier. The same house where I'd been made to feel unwelcome in my own home. It felt like justice. But the story doesn't end there. Not even close. You see, Sarah and Kevin found a small rental house across town, and their new reality set in quickly. Between Kevin's part-time job and Sarah's teaching salary, they could barely afford rent and basic expenses. There was no money for extras, no budget for the kids' activities or college savings. Tommy had been planning to attend the state university in the fall, but without any family financial support, he'd have to take out massive student loans or settle for community college. Emma had to quit the dance classes she'd been taking since she was 8 years old. Their standard of living dropped dramatically overnight. Meanwhile, I was rattling around in a 3-bedroom house that was way too big for one person. I could have sold it and made a tidy profit, but I had other plans. I decided to turn it into a rental property. The house was in a good school district, perfect for families with children. I fixed up a few minor issues, painted the walls, and listed it for rent at market rate, which was significantly more than Sarah and Kevin could ever afford on their combined income. Within 2 weeks, I had it rented to a nice young couple with twin toddlers, professional people who appreciated a well-maintained home and paid their rent on time every month. The rental income, combined with my Social Security and pension, left me quite comfortable financially. I moved into a senior living community, not the one Sarah had tried to force on me, but a nice place I chose for myself. And here's the really beautiful part. Every month when I deposited that rent check, I thought about Sarah and Kevin struggling in their cramped rental house, probably driving past their old home and seeing another family living in the place they'd lost through their own greed. But even that wasn't the end of the story. In March 2023, about 3 months after they'd moved out, Sarah called me. She sounded desperate. Kevin had been fired from his job at the sporting goods store. Apparently, he'd been caught stealing merchandise. Nothing major, just some equipment he claimed he was going to pay for later. But theft is theft, and they have zero-tolerance policies for that kind of thing. With Kevin unemployed again and their savings exhausted, they couldn't make rent. The landlord was threatening eviction if they didn't catch up on payments within 30 days. Sarah was calling to ask if I'd consider lending them money. The audacity was breathtaking. After everything they'd done, after choosing money over family, after throwing me out like garbage, she had the nerve to ask me for help. I asked her if she was serious. She started crying on the phone, talking about how desperate they were, how the kids might end up homeless, how she didn't know where else to turn. I reminded her that I wasn't family anymore, that she'd made that choice very clearly when she decided her husband's fantasies were more important than her father's well-being. I told her to call Danny. Maybe he had some investment opportunities that could solve their problems. She hung up on me. 2 weeks later, I heard through mutual friends that they'd been evicted, had to move in with Kevin's parents temporarily while they figured out their next steps. Kevin's parents lived in a 1-bedroom apartment. Sarah, Kevin, and 2 teenagers crammed into a living room with no privacy, no space, no dignity. It was a hard fall from the comfortable suburban life I'd helped them maintain for 2 years. But wait, there's more. In June 2023, I got a call from a lawyer representing Danny, Kevin's golden boy brother. Turns out Danny's cryptocurrency trading platform had been a complete fraud. He'd been running a classic Ponzi scheme, using new investors' money to pay fake returns to early investors while skimming huge amounts for his luxury lifestyle. The FBI had arrested him on federal fraud charges. Multiple families had lost their life savings investing in his fake companies. The total damage was estimated at over $2 million across dozens of victims. The lawyer was calling because Kevin was listed as one of Danny's co-conspirators. Apparently, Kevin had been actively recruiting investors for Danny's schemes even after I'd refused to participate. He'd convinced several of his former co-workers and some neighbors to invest their retirement savings in Danny's fraudulent platform. When those people lost their money, they'd filed criminal complaints naming Kevin as the person who'd convinced them to invest. The lawyer wanted to know if I'd been pressured to invest, if I'd lost any money, if I wanted to join the class action lawsuit against the brothers. I told him I'd been smart enough not to fall for the scam, thanks to my conservative, old-fashioned thinking. But the legal troubles were just beginning for Kevin. The fraud investigation revealed that Kevin had received referral fees for bringing in new investors, money he'd never reported as income to the IRS. Tax evasion charges were added to the fraud allegations. Even worse, some of the people he'd recruited were elderly relatives and family friends who'd trusted him with their life savings. The emotional betrayal was almost as devastating as the financial losses. Kevin was facing serious federal prison time. Sarah tried to distance herself from the situation, claiming she'd never known about Kevin's involvement in Danny's schemes. But investigators found text messages and emails proving she'd been aware of at least some of the recruitment efforts. While she wasn't charged criminally, She was named as a defendant in several civil lawsuits from people seeking to recover their losses. Their financial situation went from bad to catastrophic. Legal fees for Kevin's defense were astronomical. Sarah had to take out loans against her teacher's pension just to pay for basic legal representation. They lost Kevin's parents' apartment when the landlord found out about the criminal charges. The family ended up in a homeless shelter. Tommy had to drop out of community college and get a full-time job to help support the family. Emma was struggling in school, dealing with the shame and social isolation of being homeless. And through it all, I was living comfortably in my senior community, collecting rent from their former home, watching their lives implode from a safe distance. Did I feel guilty? Sometimes. Late at night, when I'd remember Emma's laugh or Tommy's excitement about his high school graduation, I'd wonder if I was being too harsh. But then I'd remember that October day in 2021, when my own daughter looked me in the eye and chose money over family, when she threw away 30 years of love and sacrifice for the promise of easy wealth. Actions have consequences. They'd made their choices, and now they were living with the results. The trial began in October 2023, exactly 2 years after they'd kicked me out. I attended every day of the proceedings, sitting in the back row of the courtroom, watching Kevin's life get dissected by federal prosecutors. The evidence was overwhelming. Financial records showing the referral payments he'd received, text messages where he bragged about his brother's success and encouraged friends to invest their retirement savings, recorded phone calls where he made specific promises about guaranteed returns. Kevin's defense was that he'd been a victim too, manipulated by his charismatic brother into believing the investments were legitimate. His lawyer painted him as a desperate, unemployed man who'd been taken advantage of by a master manipulator. But the prosecution had a different story. They portrayed Kevin as a willing accomplice who'd known exactly what he was doing when he recruited vulnerable people into a fraudulent scheme. The victims who testified were heartbreaking to watch. Elderly couples who'd lost everything they'd worked for decades to save. Young families who'd trusted Kevin with their children's college funds. Working-class people who'd believed his promises about financial freedom. One woman, a retired teacher who'd worked with Sarah, had invested $40,000 based on Kevin's personal guarantee that the returns were safe and consistent. She'd lost everything and now had to work part-time at a grocery store just to pay for her prescription medications. Another victim was Kevin's former supervisor at the insurance company, a man who'd tried to help Kevin find work after the layoffs. Kevin had repaid that kindness by convincing him to invest his entire 401k in Danny's fake trading platform. The testimonies painted Kevin as a predator who'd exploited personal relationships for financial gain. Sarah testified on his behalf, trying to portray him as a loving husband and father who'd made mistakes, but didn't deserve to go to prison. She broke down crying on the stand, talking about how the charges were destroying their family. But under cross-examination, the prosecution revealed text messages where Sarah had celebrated Kevin's referral payments, where she'd talked about the expensive things they'd be able to buy once the investments paid off. She'd known. Maybe not all the details, but she'd known Kevin was making money by recruiting investors, and she'd been happy to benefit from it. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Kevin was convicted on 12 counts of wire fraud, conspiracy, and tax evasion. At his sentencing in December 2023, he was given 8 years in federal prison. Sarah wasn't criminally charged, but the civil lawsuits continued. Several victims won judgments against both Kevin and Sarah, claiming she'd benefited from the fraudulent scheme and should be held financially responsible for their losses. Their wages were garnished, their bank accounts frozen. Any income Sarah earned from teaching was immediately seized to pay victim restitution. She had to declare bankruptcy. And me? I was still collecting rent from their former home, still living comfortably, still watching their lives fall apart piece by piece. But here's where the story takes an interesting turn. In January 2024, Tommy came to see me. He was 20 years old now, working 2 jobs to support his mother and sister while his father sat in federal prison. He looked older than his years, worn down by responsibilities no kid should have to carry. We met at a coffee shop downtown. Neutral territory where we could talk without the emotional baggage of family history. Tommy was direct and honest in a way his parents had never been. He said he understood why I was angry, why I'd felt betrayed by his parents' actions. He didn't try to make excuses or justify what they'd done, but he asked me to consider the impact my revenge was having on him and Emma. They were innocent victims of their parents' greed, but they were paying the price for crimes they'd never committed. Emma was struggling with depression and anxiety, ashamed to go to school because everyone knew about her father's crimes. She'd gone from being a happy, confident teenager to a withdrawn, angry kid who was failing most of her classes. Tommy had given up his own dreams of college and career to work minimum-wage jobs just to keep food on the table. He was living the same kind of sacrifice everything for family life I'd lived when I was raising Sarah alone. He wasn't asking me to forgive his parents or give them money. He understood that bridge had been burned beyond repair, but he wondered if there was anything I could do to help him and Emma build a better future. Not charity, he was quick to clarify, but maybe some kind of opportunity to earn a fresh start. I listened to everything he had to say, and I'll admit, it affected me. These kids had been caught in the crossfire of adult stupidity and greed. They'd lost their home, their father, their financial security, their social standing, everything, because of decisions they'd had no part in making. But at the same time, I remembered being dismissed and discarded when they needed to choose between easy money and family loyalty. I remembered being told I wasn't part of their family anymore. I told Tommy I'd think about it. That night I did a lot of soul-searching. Had my revenge gone too far? Was I punishing innocent kids for their parents' sins? Or was this just the natural consequence of Sarah and Kevin's choices? They'd destroyed their own family through greed and betrayal. I'd just refused to enable their self-destruction. I thought about my own childhood, growing up without a father who'd abandoned our family for his own selfish reasons. I thought about raising Sarah alone, working double shifts to give her opportunities I'd never had. I thought about the sacrifices I'd made, the love I'd given, the loyalty I'd shown, and how quickly it had all been thrown away when something better came along. But I also thought about Tommy's face as he talked about his sister's depression, about working 2 jobs just to keep her in school, about giving up his own dreams to clean up his parents' mess. That's when I made a decision that surprised even me. I called Tommy the next week and made him an offer. I owned a house, his former house, that was generating good rental income. I was getting older and didn't really need the money or the hassle of being a landlord anymore. If he could prove himself responsible and trustworthy, I'd consider selling him the house at a significant discount. Not giving it to him, but offering him a chance to earn it back through hard work and good choices. The terms were strict. He'd need to maintain steady employment, keep his grades up if he decided to go back to school, and take full responsibility for his sister's care and education. No contact with his father until Kevin served his full sentence. No financial support for Sarah beyond basic necessities. In exchange, I'd sell him the house for exactly what I'd paid for it, the $80,000 I'd given Sarah and Kevin, plus improvements and closing costs. About half of what it was actually worth. He'd have to get his own financing, which wouldn't be easy given his limited credit history and income. But if he could make it work, he'd have a chance to give Emma the stable home environment she needed to get her life back on track. Tommy was stunned. He'd expected me to tell him to pound sand, not offer him an opportunity to reclaim his family's former home. He asked why I was willing to do this for them when I clearly hated their parents. I told him the truth. I didn't hate Sarah and Kevin. I was disappointed in them, hurt by their betrayal, disgusted by their choices. But hate was too strong a word for people I'd once loved. What I hated was the way they'd thrown away our family for the promise of easy money, the way they'd chosen greed over gratitude, fantasy over reality. But Tommy and Emma hadn't made those choices. They were victims of their parents' stupidity, just like I was. The difference was, they were young enough to recover from it if they made better decisions going forward. Tommy asked for time to think about the offer and figure out if he could make the financing work. 3 months later, he came back with a business plan that impressed the hell out of me. He'd been researching real estate, talking to lenders, learning about investment strategies and property management. He'd found a local credit union that was willing to work with him on a special first-time homebuyer program, using his employment history and the discounted purchase price to qualify for a loan. But more than that, he'd thought through the long-term implications. He wanted to use part of the house as a rental unit to generate income, while he and Emma lived in the rest. The additional income would help with mortgage payments and give him experience in property management. He'd also enrolled in night classes at the community college, working toward a degree in business administration. Emma's grades had improved dramatically once she knew there was hope for stability in her future. Most importantly, he'd set clear boundaries with his mother. He'd help her with basic necessities when he could, but he wouldn't enable her poor decisions or bail her out of problems she'd created for herself. The kid had learned from his parents' mistakes in a way his parents never had. We closed on the house in June 2024, almost exactly 1 year after Kevin had been sentenced to prison. Tommy moved back into his childhood home, this time as the owner rather than a dependent child. Emma got her old bedroom back and started making friends at school again. I attended the closing, watching Tommy sign papers with the same serious concentration I'd seen when he was doing homework at my kitchen table years earlier. After the signing was complete, he shook my hand and thanked me for giving him a chance to prove himself. I told him the real test was still ahead, making the mortgage payments, being a responsible homeowner, taking care of his sister, building a better life than his parents had managed. He said he understood the responsibility, and he wouldn't let me down. So far, he's kept his word. Tommy's been making his mortgage payments on time every month. Emma's grades have improved dramatically, and she's even started taking dance classes again, paying for them herself with money she earns babysitting neighbors' kids. They've turned part of the house into a small apartment that they rent to a graduate student, generating enough income to cover about half their mortgage payment. Tommy graduated from community college last month with honors and has been accepted to the state university to finish his bachelor's degree. He's planning to study while continuing to work and maintain the rental property. Meanwhile, Sarah is still struggling. Without Kevin's income and with most of her wages garnished for victim restitution, she's barely surviving financially. She's had to move in with various friends and relatives, never staying anywhere long enough to establish real stability. The civil lawsuits from Kevin's fraud victims are ongoing. Even after Kevin is released from prison, they'll both be paying restitution for years to come. Sarah has tried to contact me several times, usually when she's facing eviction or can't pay for basic necessities. She still doesn't seem to understand that our relationship ended permanently when she chose money over family. I don't respond to her calls. Kevin is scheduled for release in 2031, assuming good behavior. He'll be in his mid-50s with a felony record that will make finding decent employment almost impossible. The victims of his fraud will be waiting to garnish any income he manages to earn. He'll probably spend the rest of his life paying for the consequences of his greed and betrayal. As for me, I'm doing well, living comfortably in my senior community, enjoying retirement activities, making new friends who don't see me as a source of funding for their fantasies. I see Tommy and Emma occasionally, not as their grandfather because that relationship was severed by their parents' choices, but as the person who gave them a second chance when they needed it most. They've earned my respect through their actions, something their parents never managed to do. Looking back on everything that's happened, I don't regret my decisions. Could I have been more forgiving? Could I have found a way to maintain family relationships despite the betrayal? Maybe. But forgiveness without accountability is just enabling bad behavior. Sarah and Kevin needed to learn that actions have consequences, that you can't treat people like garbage and expect them to keep coming back for more. The fact that they destroyed their own family through greed isn't my fault or my responsibility to fix. What I did was protect myself from people who'd proven they couldn't be trusted. I used legal means to secure my financial future and ensure that the people who'd betrayed me couldn't continue to take advantage of my generosity. If that's revenge, so be it. But I prefer to think of it as justice. There's an important lesson in all of this for anyone listening to my story. Family relationships aren't unconditional. Love isn't a blank check that people can cash indefinitely without giving anything back. When someone shows you who they really are through their actions, believe them the first time, Don't make excuses for people who repeatedly choose their own interests over your well-being. Don't enable destructive behavior by bailing people out of consequences they've created for themselves. And most importantly, don't let anyone convince you that setting boundaries and protecting yourself is somehow wrong or selfish. I spent decades sacrificing for people who ultimately saw me as nothing more than a source of funding for their dreams. When I finally stopped enabling their poor choices, they painted me as the villain. But I'm not the villain in this story. I'm the person who finally learned to value himself enough to stop accepting unacceptable treatment. That's not revenge, that's self-respect. The real tragedy is that it took 70 years for me to learn that lesson, that I had to lose my family to discover my own worth. But maybe that's why I'm telling this story now. Maybe someone listening will recognize themselves in my situation and make better choices before it's too late. Maybe someone will learn to set boundaries before they're forced to build walls. Maybe someone will understand that enabling destructive behavior isn't love, it's just another form of abuse. Or maybe someone will realize that the people who claim to love you but only contact you when they need something aren't really family at all. They're just users wearing familiar faces. I'm 73 years old now. I don't have unlimited time left to waste on people who don't appreciate what I have to offer. The years I have remaining will be spent with people who choose to be in my life because they value my company, not because they want access to my bank account. That's a lesson worth learning, even if it comes later than it should. Tommy and Emma figured it out while they're still young enough to build better lives. They learned from their parents' mistakes instead of repeating them. They chose responsibility over entitlement, hard work over easy money, authentic relationships over manipulative ones. They earned their second chance through their actions, not their words. And in doing so, they showed me something their parents never could, that sometimes the best revenge isn't hurting the people who wronged you. Sometimes the best revenge is helping their children become better people than they ever were. That's a victory worth more than any amount of money or property. That's justice served with hope instead of bitterness. And that's why I can tell this story without anger consuming me. I won. Not by destroying my enemies, but by refusing to let their betrayal destroy me. I won by teaching the next generation that love isn't measured by what you're willing to give up, but by what you're willing to stand up for. I won by showing Tommy and Emma that integrity matters more than easy money, that hard work builds character in ways that shortcuts never can. And most importantly, I won by learning that family isn't defined by blood or obligation. It's defined by mutual respect, genuine care, and the willingness to support each other through both good times and bad. Sarah and Kevin failed that test. They chose greed over gratitude, fantasy over reality, manipulation over honest communication. Tommy and Emma passed it. They chose accountability over excuses, hard work over entitlement, authentic relationships over transactional ones. The difference in outcome speaks for itself. So if you're facing a similar situation, if you're dealing with family members who see you as nothing more than a source of funding for their dreams, remember my story. Remember that setting boundaries isn't cruel. It's necessary. Remember that enabling destructive behavior isn't love, it's codependency. Remember that you can't save people who aren't willing to save themselves. And remember that sometimes the kindest thing you can do is let people face the consequences of their own choices. It might be painful in the short term, but it's the only way they'll ever learn to make better decisions. And if they don't learn, at least you'll have protected yourself from their destructive patterns. Either way, you win. That's the real lesson of my story. Not that revenge is always the answer, but that self-respect should never be negotiable. Not that family relationships don't matter, but that they have to be based on mutual respect to be worth maintaining. Not that money doesn't matter, but that it should never be more important than integrity. These are hard lessons, learned through painful experience, but they're lessons worth learning no matter how much they cost. Because at the end of the day, the only person you have to face in the mirror is yourself. Make sure that person is someone you can respect. Make sure that person is someone who stands up for what's right, even when it's difficult. Make sure that person is someone who values themselves enough to demand better treatment from others. That's what I finally learned at 70 years old. Better late than never. And if my story helps even one person learn that lesson earlier in life, then sharing it was worth the pain of reliving it. Because everyone deserves to be treated with respect and dignity. Everyone deserves relationships based on genuine care rather than selfish need. Everyone deserves better than being treated like an ATM by people who claim to love them. That includes you, whoever you are, wherever you're listening to this. You deserve better. Don't settle for less. And don't let anyone convince you that demanding respect is somehow wrong. It's not. It's the foundation of every healthy relationship you'll ever have. Remember that, and you'll save yourself years of heartache and betrayal. Trust me on this one. I'm 73 years old and I've learned that lesson the hard way. Learn it the easy way instead. Your future self will thank you. And if you found value in my story, if it made you think about your own relationships and boundaries, hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories that might just change your perspective. Because sometimes, the most important lessons come from the people who've already walked the difficult path you're facing. Sometimes wisdom is just pain shared in the hopes that others won't have to experience it themselves. That's what I'm offering you today. Take it or leave it. But don't say nobody ever warned you about what happens when family love becomes one-sided and conditional. Don't say nobody ever told you that setting boundaries is an act of self-love, not selfishness. And don't say nobody ever showed you that sometimes the people who hurt you most are the ones who force you to discover your own strength. Because now you know. What you do with that knowledge is up to you.